good morning, good evening, good night, good day, wherever you're watching us from. We appreciate you tuning in for this video. As always, we enjoy our people coming in and watching and on these videos. We appreciate it so much. If you would, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. That way you can keep getting notified every time a new video is posted and when it premieres. If you got any questions or comments, you can go to our website at webbaptist.com or go over to Facebook and leave us a comment over there on one of our posts, and we'll be glad to get back to you at our earliest convenience. If you have a prayer request, bring it to us and we'll be praying for your needs. Today's video, we're talking about the Pharisees as a topic. Who are they and where did they come from? And why were they just such a pain in regards to Jesus' ministry during the 3.5 years that he was on this earth? The thing that we want to look at is I'm going to go through briefly explaining who the Pharisees were, their origins, and what they're all about. And I'm going to paint with broad strokes, which means I'm going to be very general and give you a condensed overview of what the Pharisees were. And if you want to get more details, by all means, do the research on your own and get digging into it, just on some of the specifics that you want. I won't hit on a lot of the history that goes on because most of their history is going to be in the 400 silent period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That stuff is going to come at a later date for later videos. Those details I'm just going to briefly brush over, but not really dig into a lot of the minutia and a lot of the details of the stuff that I'm talking about. But it's important for us, I think, that we, because in our Bible series, we're getting into the Gospel of Mark, and we're starting to see how the Pharisees are speaking out against Jesus. They don't care for what he's doing. They think he's blasphemous. He's doing things on the Sabbath and holy days. He's doing stuff. He's eating with sinners and tax collectors, and all of this is a big no-no to them. So, I mean, who are these people? So that's what we're getting into today. As you know, we go from the Old Testament, where we had prophets speaking, telling the people to repent, turn back to God, and of course they don't. And all the power in the Old Testament is developing over in the East in Persia, okay? And you had no real major religious groups at the end of the Old Testament. So you had prophets speaking on behalf of God, warning of judgment. You had the power growing in Persia, Babylon, Assyria, over in the East. And you really didn't have, you just had a hodgepodge of people believing whatever they wanted and rebelling against God. Okay? So after that 400 years, when the Old Testament ends, we have John the Baptist, we have Jesus, and we see the power has moved from the East to the West in Rome. Okay? So this would be a big difference. And the religious groups that we have is primarily scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodian, and Sanhedrin. And so we do have some philosophical, religious, and social, political, geopolitical movements emerging in the establishments that are starting to get set. And but today we're going to be talking about the Pharisees because they're the primary group that opposed Jesus. And he primarily spoke against them. So we went from prophets, no religious groups, to now we got a bunch of religious groups, and we only have first John the Baptist, and then we have Jesus. Okay, so that's where we are in that. So when we look at the Pharisees, the name Pharisee means separate ones. Okay, so and when I get through this, you'll see that they're trying to separate. Their goal is to separate God's people from the rest of the world. Okay? So at the end of the Old Testament, the Jewish people, of course, were being enslaved and dragged away, as God predicted with numerous prophets, primarily with, especially with Jeremiah, that they would be taken away and they were to live and prosper where they are because they weren't going to be coming home anytime soon. And so what we have is a group of people who really they lost their identity, okay, so to speak. They weren't close to God. They believed just about everything out there. They accepted the world's ways and the cultures and that kind of stuff. So now in the New Testament, we have a group of people who are strictly trying to keep themselves separated from God. So they went from being very open, lackadaisical, and didn't care about God or the faith. They believed anything and everything, and very nonchalant and wide open with a very, if you want to say, liberal lifestyle of believe anything you want, do whatever you want, that kind of stuff, to, at the end of the Old Testament, to a society that was very strict on the Mosaic laws and the customs and traditions and the oral traditions that was handed down from their past. So they went from one side of the pendulum and they swung all the way to the other side, okay? And God kind of wants them on this side, but he also wants them to have love and compassion for one another. And they also need to get out and they need to tell something, because they were established as a nation of priests. And so they haven't been doing that. So when Jesus comes along, yeah, they realize they learn from their mistakes from the captivity and the diaspora at that time. However, in forsaking all other idols and being strict with the law and interpretation, they've hardened their hearts and they missed God's ultimate message, which is to love your neighbor. So anyway, so Pharisee means separate ones, and I'm looking at my notes and I'll explain the notes in a minute. So they're not mentioned at all in the Old Testament, okay? But they're very prominent in the New Testament. And we'll see that they developed in that period in between the testaments, that 400 silent years. They are constantly, in all four Gospels, they are constantly testing Jesus. They're always keeping up with him, testing him, watching what he's doing, scrutinizing Jesus, challenging what he's saying. And they're mentioned in Acts and the epistles as well. But for the most part, by that time, the faith and the floodgates of heaven in regards to the message to the people is they can't contain it, and it's out there. And but they're constantly kind of a thorn in Jesus' side, so to speak. And he was a direct threat to their philosophy, their religion, their approach, their life, everything. So, and we'll see why in a minute. The biggest reason I think that what you're looking at with the Pharisees is, and this is, you can glean this from reading the Gospels and what Jesus was saying, is that they were very, very, very extremely picky, and granular is the word that I come across in a lot of the studies. And what I mean by that is, if you and I were to look at the beach, and you would see oceans, waves, a nice sunset, and that kind of stuff. Rightly so, but if I was a Pharisee, I would be looking at the grains of sand. And that's where they are. They took everything in their lives and they broke it down to the minutest part. And then by doing that, they missed the big picture, the overall picture, okay? So they would be really stuck into these small, minute interpretations of the Mosaic law and applying that to every facet of their lives. And again, you really start breaking down and you're living on that very fine line where, it's kind of extreme, that the law is more important than the heart. It's more important than the interpretation of the law. It's more important than your brother and your neighbor, that these laws be abided by, because they're from God. Forget the love and compassion part, which is what Jesus was always countering them with, because they didn't have that. Their hearts were hardened to the fact that they were just stuck on looking at the small minutia of every sin, that they never saw the big picture. So how powerful were they? Well, in Josephus, and I got the complete works of Josephus, and I've studied it a lot, and it's one of the few books I don't write in, because I know that over the years I did a lot of studying in this, and I would recommend, if you're really into studying history, Josephus is a historian, a Jewish historian. His works primarily are around the 400 silent years in between the testaments, okay? And now he is not, he's a historian, okay? He's a scribe. He's documenting the stuff that's going on, and he's using other sources. He's putting this down in writing, and those writings have survived. So a lot of our history during that 400 years is a lot to do with Josephus, along with outside sources as well, but he kind of had the closest eyewitness view of a lot of stuff. If not the eyewitness, he had second and third sources of stuff that happened at that time, the rebellions and the revolts and all that. So in his work in the Antiquities of the Jews, he and I'm quoting him, these have such a great power over the multitude, meaning the Pharisees. These have such a great power over the multitude that when they say anything against the king or against the high priest, they are presently believed. And what Josephus is saying is, of all the power factions at this time, during Jesus' time in the early New Testament and in the New Testament, the Pharisees pretty much controlled everything. They had strong influence, okay? So they were the biggest group, the most influential group of policy and religion and governance at that time. Okay, so it's no mistake that they would come after Jesus and Jesus would meet them head on. So that's where we are with that. Now, who are the Pharisees? Okay, let's be clear. They're not necessarily religious, they're not necessarily government, they're not necessarily political, they're not necessarily social. They encompass all of those, okay? And keep that in mind. They're kind of hard to nail down and put into a box. When I tell you about the priests of the temple, that's easily defined. Their job is to take care of the temple and the rituals and the celebrations and the feasts that pertain to the temple. That's easy to define. But with the Pharisees, you can't really say that because they weren't necessarily priests. They weren't necessarily rich. They weren't necessarily poor. They were a lot of that stuff in between. So we're going to break down each one of those reflections and pages or facets of what they are. So if we look at the religious sect of what they were a religious sect because they believed in specific beliefs that separate them from other groups like the Sadducees and the Essenes. And we'll cover them in another video. And they're just another type of group. So the religious part of them, they did follow the Bible, the Torah at the time. They followed the Torah and they believed in oral tradition. So not only do you study the Torah and you know it inside and out, but you got to know the oral history that goes along with it. The oral history to them is just as important as the written history, okay? So that is passed down and from father to son. That chain, as you speak, going through the generations, that oral history was very important to them. And so that's one thing that's kind of separated them from everything else. They didn't believe just in the Torah. They did, but they believed that the oral traditions accompany that were just as important as the Torah itself. So the stories and exploits of Abraham, Noah, Joshua, King David, Solomon, all of this stuff was passed down verbatim from father to son through hundreds of years. Okay, so that's kind of what they believed in, and they believed in taking and putting that into practice, not just in the temple, but in the lives. And we'll get to that in just a second. Now, as a political group, what kind of political influence do they have? Well, because of their size, they influenced government and political agenda. So their desire was to keep and preserve Judaism against foreign nations. They knew from history that other religions, other factions, and other beliefs were a problem with the people, with God's people. They believed in a strict interpretation and a strict separation from Gentile nations. Okay, they wanted the desire to keep the God's people's identity separate and unique. They didn't want to have any outside influence, and what they do is they say, look at our history, especially our more recent history where we just got back from captivity, and you know what? Enough's enough. We're going to separate. We're not going to believe. We're not going to Baal and Beelzebub and Ashtor and all these other gods that we had at one time in our past. Forget it. This is what we need to do, and we're going to stick by this rule. We're going to stick by tradition. We're going to stick by the law. We're going to stick by the word of God in the Moses as well as the oral tradition. So that political group had a big influence on governors and administrators and sometimes the priests. Okay, so that political part had a big influence on day-to-day operations within the city-state. Cities and state of Israel. So now the social movement is kind of obvious. It's kind of hard for you to have government and religious without having social commentary to go along with it. I mean, just kind of look in our lives today here in the United States. The political parties have a big influence over social. They have a social influence. We talk about, for good or bad, we talk about governance and politicians and political policy all the time through social media, TV, and all that stuff. And that's also what they do. Their social movement, they didn't separate religion from society. Society was part of that. Okay, so you don't have to necessarily go to the temple to do all the things that need to be done. You can do a lot of the purification process, a lot of the worship, and a lot of the rituals that go along with your faith. You can do that at home as well. You don't necessarily have to do that in the temple, because I think that's another problem that the Pharisees had, was so many people, the Jewish society would put everything of God in the temple, but outside the temple they weren't practicing anything. The Pharisees would say, no, we need to take what we practice and preach and worship in the temple, and we need to apply that to our daily lives as well. They were correct in this. However, again, they got stuck on the minutiae of the law. And so that was very important. Now, philosophical sect, again, if you look at Josephus, they're one of three schools of thought during this time. Okay, and I went over the others, which is, the Pharisees and Sadducees. The Essenes were a little bit extreme. So their philosophy, like I said, was contrary to the priest, and I'll explain that in just a second. But their philosophy was, we are separate, again, separate ones. We are separate from other nations. We are children of God, and we need to preserve our faith, tradition, and values because we are set apart. So it's always us only, us against the world. Okay? Now, they have a very strict interpretation of Mosaic laws along with their oral traditions. So, and they believe without the oral traditions, the Jewish people were missing the key instruction on how to follow the Torah. So, it's kind of weird for us to sit here and say, when we read the Bible, it's very important that we know the Bible verbatim inside and out so we can properly interpret the Bible. Now, in our day and age, the Bible is very important for us to use as a source of information, correct information, because we don't want to misquote what God may say or what Scripture says in regards to something we may be saying or witnessing or debating someone. In their case, they're saying, in order for you to get the Scripture right, you have to know the oral history correct, which is kind of alien concept to us. But you got to keep in mind that these people, they always studied Scripture. They knew it inside and out. They knew it verbatim. They knew it vowel by vowel, word for word, letter by letter. And it's kind of hard for us to understand that because we've got so many distractions in our lives. But just think about that. If you had to know a book inside and out, and you had to quote it verbatim from start to finish, could you do that? Besides Dr. Seuss books. So that's their strict interpretation of the law. That strict, no deviation. You do this and that only, okay? And you look at the book of Leviticus, how those things are outlined, that's how we're going to live, no exceptions whatsoever. It doesn't matter if anything, there's exception to the rule. No, there's no exception to the rule, because this is what we go by because we're God's children. So they had this very strict interpretation of Mosaic law. Now, what they wanted to do is they wanted to take the practices that were going inside the temple and put those outside the temple. And what they were telling the people was, okay, we lost our temple, okay? So, and our captivity in foreign lands was very hard for us to keep doing those things in the temple, right? Okay, so if we can't do them in the temple, we can do them in the synagogues, we can do them at home. So what the Pharisees were saying was, let's take those Mosaic laws and apply them to our lives and practice them wherever we are, okay? Which is a very noble concept. However, that strict interpretation made it very strict, unyielding, unbending on every area of their lives. And to a point that it was kind of crippling and suffocating. And that's what Jesus had a problem with. That they were so stuck on the law that they couldn't enjoy life. They couldn't see the love and compassion for a neighbor. They could not see the joy in life. For lack of a, I mean, it was kind of, they were already dead inside, as whitewashed tombs, as Jesus says. So it's one of those things that it's kind of hard to explain right now, because the Pharisees wanted everybody to practice Mosaic law and apply that, and it got to a point where it was just so stifling and suffocating, where people were more putting ritual over everything else. And as always, a lot of people can't live up to these laws and provisions, and they just can't do it. They get stuck on these, and they fail every time. And so that's another reason why we need Jesus. We can't live by ritual and law and pointless process all the time. We can't do it. We fail ourselves every time. So, and they did promote a belief in the afterlife with God, but and not a group they're easily defined. Some were priests, some were lawyers, some were administrators, some were clerks, some were scribes, some were businessmen. The thing that you got, I think the easiest way to separate them is like this. The priests and the Sadducees were, of course, the priest and the rich elite. Okay, we're talking about the people who had all the money, as with every society. So the Sadducees were a small group, but they were a very powerful group, because any group of society, there's always going to be a few who rise to the top, do their work or opportunities or both. And that small 10, 15, 20%, they're going to be powerful because of the money and influence that they have. Okay? And everybody else is going to fall below that. So the Sadducees made up priests and the wealthy elite at this time. Now, the Pharisees make up more of what we call the middle class. Okay, so the middle class is a lot bigger than the social elite or the rich, and they tend to have more influence and control. Now, that doesn't mean that they're always at odds with the Sadducees or the priests. It just means they're just going to have more control over the population in general. Okay, that could be a good thing or a bad thing, especially because you have to think that the priests and the Pharisees and Sadducees, for the most part, were kind of on the same page. It's just the details that they probably disagree with most of the time. There was always going to be a power struggle there. the Sadducees had the wealth, the money, and the army, and the Pharisees had all the influence and a good portion of the wealth. But it's not like that the Pharisees had an organized movement. Because again, you had doctors, lawyers, you had professions, you had administrators, you had clerks, and these people came from all walks of life across the countryside. Okay, so it's not like they lived in one place and they were that big, powerful group. They were just a loosely, again, sect of people of religious, political, geopolitical beliefs. It's kind of like today where we have Democrats and Republicans. You can look at it along those lines too if you wanted to consider, or you can envision that there'd be some kind of religious beliefs on either side that are associated with their government policies. So that's where they are. So the Pharisees came from all walks of life, all professions and roots and a lot of different things. Now, the Sadducees, like I said, they wanted to keep the purity rituals in the temple, okay? But the Pharisees wanted everybody to practice those outside as well as inside. They're not getting rid of the temple. They're just saying, well, if we can't make it to the temple, we're going to do it at home, because not everybody wants to come once a week to the temple. So what happens during the week when they sin? Well, they can do some of these purification rituals at home. So that's one of the dividing between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, if we look at the origin of the Pharisees. So now we take a moment and we look at the origins. Now, the origins are real simple, and like I said, I'm going to paint with very broad strokes on this. Their roots actually go back to the time of Moses and the Torah, if by name and not practice, or by practice, not name, I should say, because they were practicing the oral traditions at that time as well, as long as with the Torah. They're first mentioned in the Second Temple period, and they were, they went from 515 BC to 70 AD, but we go back a bit further to kind of see how we got started there. So as we know, we look at the Persians were the first ones to come in and conquer this territory and this nation, Judah, and Israel, and then Judah. And so 539, the Persian king conquered Babylon, and when he'd done that, he allowed the Jews to return back home, which is a good thing. However, he told the Jews, you cannot have a king, which was probably a good thing given their track record with kings over the past couple hundred years. So, but they were able to go back home, rebuild their temple, and practice their religion, but they could not have a king. So what happened? So who fills that power vacuum? Well, the only organized power at that time would be the priests. So now the priests are in charge, not just the temple and the faith, but they're in charge in governing the population. So without a king and without administrators, the priests were pretty much in charge. And that's how the priests and the Sadducees emerged, and it put all the power under the priest and the wealthy. So due to King Cyrus kind of making that situation where you couldn't have a king, he made a kind of another monster, so to speak. Now, the first temple was built under Solomon, and it was destroyed. And then the second temple was built under supervision of King Cyrus. Now, the Jews were kind of split on that, okay? So you had this king who gave them permission to do that, but they couldn't have a king. Well, they didn't like being told what to do. Was this really our temple, or were we doing this because King Cyrus said so? So it's kind of crazy in that regard. So now it's back in 539 BC. So we fast forward to 167 BC. King Antiochus IV of the Seleucids, which is, again, I'm painting with broad strokes. I don't want to get into the minutiae of history, but the Seleucids were kind of in the Syria area, and it was founded by one of the generals under Alexander the Great. Because after Alexander the Great's empire, after he died, it was split up among the generals, and one of them was Seleucids. So Seleucids sacked the temple. Okay, King Antiochus of the Fourth sacked the temple, and he took everything. Okay, so he sacked the temple, and he forced the Jews to accept the Greek cultures and customs. So you can no longer believe and worship your way. You got to accept what the Greek customs that we got going on. We conquered you, and you got to live the way we want you to live. So for about 2 years, that's exactly what happened. Finally, the Jews revolted in the Maccabean revolts and won back Jerusalem and the temple. So after fighting, 2 years later, they said, we had enough of this. They fought, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees emerged at this time. The Pharisees emerged at this time, okay, because the Sadducees were already there. So the Pharisees come along during this time, and they kind of establish power, saying, look, we're done doing other religions, and we are done doing other beliefs. We're going to start doing it this way. And that's how that pretty much got started. They got tired of looking at the Greek customs and traditions and said, we need to separate ourselves from that. Okay? And that's what happened. Now, so the Pharisees would emerge and be power and influence for up until 70 AD. Now, why is 70 AD important? Because that was the time when the temple was destroyed, finally. The second temple was destroyed. The Pharisees evolved into what we know of as rabbinic Judaism, and that's kind of what we have today. So the rabbinic rabbi Judaism that we have, and the faith, the Jewish faith that we have practiced today, it started with the Pharisees. And after the sack of the temple and the diaspora and all the shifting of power and the land grab and the empires at that time in that land, the Jews kind of morphed into the faith and the practice, the Jewish religion that we know today, okay, down through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, old Europe, and that kind of stuff, and as it spread throughout the world. Now, the Sadducees, of course, they fade into history. With the temple gone, the priests are no longer needed. They're gone. And the Sadducees, when the country is wiped out and the nation is destroyed and the people are dispersed for the most part, the wealth is taken as well. So the Sadducees pretty much fade from history after the sack of the temple. So now the sources that I use for this, I kept it broad because if you want to easily go and look at that, again, the Complete Works of Josephus gives you a good outline of some of the stuff in there in regards to the Pharisees. The Bible itself, when you see how Jesus deals with the Pharisees, gives you an idea of what they've evolved into from the time in between the intertestament period. But I used overviewbible.com. I've used encyclopediabritannica.com on the web, and I used a wiki search for the timeline period that I wanted to discuss in regards to that situation. Now, the details, again, I'm painting with broad strokes. If you want to find the details on some of the faith, the people in between, by all means, please search that out and go from there. So anyway, so that wraps up today. Like I said, we're just giving a broad strokes of who the Pharisees were, how they came into be, and why they were who they were. And so it's important to understand the history of how they came to be and how they came into conflict with Jesus during his ministry. Okay? Again, thank you for watching. We appreciate your help and your support. If you would, please like and subscribe to the channel. Comment below if you have any prayer requests or any concerns. Visit us on the website or go to Facebook and talk to us, and just let us know what you think. If you got any prayer requests, we'd be glad to pray for you for any reason that you got for us, okay? Until next time, take care and God bless.